What is going on, guys? Welcome back. In this video today we're going to learn how to properly read documentation. So let us get right into it. Alright, so we're going to learn how to properly read documentations in this video today. And this is something that you will encounter as a programmer, especially as a beginner, quite often. You will see someone asking a question, or maybe you will ask a question yourself, and people will refer to the documentation if the question is very basic. And on Stack Overflow, you might occasionally get a very toxic answer like, don't ask stupid questions, this is written in the documentation, or the famous RTFM, and you can Google what that stands for. So even though this is a quite basic topic and you might be asking yourself, why make a video on it? Isn't that self-explanatory? You just go to the documentation and read it. A lot of beginners have a hard time navigating around documentations, which is why I want to make this video, especially for beginners, even though I think intermediate and advanced programmers might benefit from it as well. I want to make this video on just a basic introduction into this skill, if you want to call it, of reading documentation. Because oftentimes what we tend to do as programmers, and I do this quite often, and it's oftentimes also the better choice to do it, is we just Google and we go to Stack Overflow to find the answer to a specific problem. How do I do this? Stack Overflow, copy, paste. It's always good if you understand what's happening, but oftentimes it's just nice to have a quick fix. However, this is not always the best way to approach a problem, especially if the problem that you're having is not just, some idea that you need to get from somewhere, but you fundamentally don't understand the module that you're working with, or maybe you don't know the correct order of parameters, or maybe you haven't worked with that part of the library that you're using right now. And in those cases, it makes much more sense to go to the documentation and educate yourself long term instead of just solving this one problem that you have right now. So I just want to talk a little bit about the basic structure of documentation and how you can get better at reading the documentation, and also when you should read the documentation. And the first thing that I would say, if you're completely overwhelmed with documentation in general, if you never read the documentation, you don't know how it's structured, I would say go into or read the docs on a module that you already know how to use. This could be Core Python. So for example, here I'm on docs.python.org. This is just the Python documentation, and here we have the built-in functions. This is just a simple page. You can look at this, and for example, maybe you know the print function. Probably you know the print function. So you can just scroll down to the print function, which you can also look for print with a bracket. There you go. And in this case, you can just look up the print function. And this is another thing that's important. Oftentimes, especially very new programmers, think that if you read the documentation, you have to read it from top to bottom. You have to read up on the full module. Documentations most of the time are to be used like references. So you have usually different parts of a documentation, which we're going to talk about here in a second. And one part is just the API reference, where you have the different functions. Like here, you have the print function, you have the property, which is a class, you have the representation function, the reversed function. And you don't have to read all of those things, obviously. You just jump to the function that you're interested in, and then you can see how it's essentially structured. You can see the print function takes arguments, as many as you want, and then it takes some keyword arguments here as well that have default values optionally. So that is a very basic example. Maybe you want to go for a specific module, which is also Core Python. You could go to the OS module. You can look up the different functions here. And you will see in the Core Python documentation, you have a very similar structure here on the left side. This would be the pickle serialization module. But what I would recommend to do is I would recommend go and look up the documentation for 2 or 3 packages that you're already comfortable working with. This might be something like NumPy, Pandas, Scikit-learn. It might be something like Requests, Beautiful Soup, or Selenium. Whatever you're working with already, whatever you know how to work with already, go to the documentation and try to navigate around it, or navigate in it. So for example, you could go to Pandas, which is pandas.pydata.org/docs. And one thing that you will notice, and this will take away a lot of the frustration or the feeling of being overwhelmed when reading documentation, is to realize that almost all documentations, of course there are exceptions, but almost all documentations follow a similar structure. In basically all of them, you will find, you will find a getting started section where you see the installation, where you see a basic Hello World-like example. So in Pandas, probably loading some data and displaying it and maybe changing some stuff about it. And then you always see this API reference. So if I go to getting started here, I will get some basic guides. So here you will see, okay, what kind of data do we handle? We see a very intuitive example here of an Excel-like table. And then basically you can see here some visualization of what Pandas is actually doing. Then you can also click on stuff that you're already familiar with. So you can see this is a getting started tutorial. So you can click here on installation. You can see how to install Pandas properly in different ways. You can go to the package overview and see what Pandas actually offers with some basic examples, getting started tutorials here. I think this is what we already saw. And then you can also compare it with other tools. This is now all just tutorial-like. This is not the classic documentation. This is not the classic API reference. If you want to have the API reference, you click on it here, and then you can see all the functions, all the possibilities. So you can go to the data frame, for example, and to all the different data frame attributes and functions. So for example, data frame dot, what's something that we use quite often? Maybe columns. This is just a list, and that's basically all it says here. It's a column, a list of column labels. Or we have something like the size, which is here also with some code examples, just the size of the data frame or of the series. And then you have probably something more complicated here as well, like maybe apply, data frame dot apply. You can just click on it and you will see a more comprehensive documentation here. And this structure now, if you already know Pandas, for example, you already know what the apply function does, you already know what size is, you already know what all these attributes are, or most of them, you can just look at this to get familiar with the structure or to become familiar with the structure. And then you can go to another one, for example, NumPy, and here you will find something quite similar. So you can see here, for example, web is just the interface. I mean, I'm not sure if Pandas and NumPy are made by the same person because that's very similar, but here you also have getting started, API reference, and then you have, again, the different things here. So for example, what can we do here? Yeah, you can click around and look for what or find what you're looking for, because that's the thing. You don't go into the documentation, especially not into the API reference, to learn about a package. You go into the documentation to check out things about a certain function. So I personally, how I do it is, when I want to start with a new package, when I want to learn about a new package or a new library that I have not used before, I go to the getting started section. So I go, for example, to NumPy, getting started. What is NumPy? I read through this stuff here, I install it, and then I look at some basic example like this one. This is a very, very basic NumPy example. And maybe I will watch a video about it as well, but at the end of the day, the documentation is either for getting started, for seeing a very basic example, or for looking up specific functions. So for example, for NumPy, maybe you want to look up the arange function. So I can just look it up here. I can just search for arange. Here I find it, NumPy arange. And what does it do? Return evenly spaced values within a given interval. And then you can see the different ways we can provide the arguments here. So, and you can do that for different functions. I often like to do it also in packages like scikit-learn if I'm not sure for machine learning algorithms which parameters are used by default. And for example, we can go to scikit-learn and maybe something like support vector classifier. And you can also just Google your way into the documentation. But maybe you want to see, okay, what kernels are supported, what's the default, and maybe you want to use a linear SVC, a linear kernel here, and you don't want to use this as the basic function, as the basic kernel here. And you can just look up default values and parameters and details about the implementation. So yeah, you can see it here again. Beautiful soup, quick start, getting help. Maybe they have different names, but the concept is the same. Now, one thing that's important after you got an idea about how this is done, don't stick to it too much, because you will find documentation where things are more confusing. where documentation is structured differently, or in the worst case, you will find no documentation or very little documentation at all. So for example, here I have SQL Alchemy or SQL Alchemy, and this is one of those packages. I think this documentation here is not very intuitive, because where do you start? I mean, you have the installation guide, sure, but I don't think that this is a very intuitive documentation. I don't know where the API reference is exactly, or even if I find it, I have to look for it. It's not as straightforward as Pandas, NumPy, Scikit-learn, Beautiful Soup. It's structured a little bit differently, but still you can apply the basic principles of you have the installation guide, or you can just go to Google and say SQL Alchemy and Alchemy and then some function. I don't know. I'm not using SQL Alchemy that often. But that's also, again, the basic idea. So here you click on a function and you, can I click on it? Yeah, you get to the section where it's explained. Now, in the case that you don't have a comprehensive documentation, like for example, for the yFinance package or for the DeepFace package, what you will oftentimes find is that you can at least find some tutorial or kind of documentation or user guideline on the PyPI page or on GitHub. So here, for example, the yFinance package doesn't have a documentation, at least as far as I know. So we can go yFinance docs, and we don't really see a documentation here. Now you have some guides, some blog posts, but you don't have, or is this actually yFinance? No, this is actually a different package. This is Yahoo Finance. But the yFinance package doesn't have a classic documentation. However, if you go to the PyPI, is it called PyPI or PyPI? I don't know. When you go to the package page, essentially, you can just scroll down here and you will find a quick start guide, and you will find some more advanced examples here as well. But you don't have a classic API reference here, at least as far as I saw. And if you don't find it here, you might want to look at GitHub. Either you can go to GitHub here directly with homepage, or you can just go and say yFinance GitHub. And then you can go to the repository, and here in this case, you'll find the same documentation, I think, or is it the same? I'm not sure. Yeah, it is roughly the same documentation, I guess. So this is also an option. And for DeepFace, I think that's the same thing. You have, again, a very comprehensive example section or quick start section here, but you don't have a classic documentation. And in the worst case, if you cannot find any documentation whatsoever, one thing that you can always do is you can go into your development environment and you can look at the source code. So for example, if I say from DeepFace import DeepFace, I can just hold Control and click on DeepFace, and I can get to the implementation here. And even if none of these functions are actually documented in a documentation, I can look at the doc strings if there are any, or at least I can look at the method itself. So here, for example, verify. Now, probably this function is also mentioned here somewhere. Pretty sure it is. So you can also just look at the examples here. But if you really want to see what's happening in the function, you can just go to the function. You can read the doc strings. You have the parameter explanation. You have the return values here. And you also have the raw code. So you can see what is the actual default here. And if the documentation is good, you can also see explained what the differences are. So for example, here you can see we have different model names. And this already tells you, without looking at the code, what the possible values are here. And you can see that the default value is this one, so the first one. So this is also an option. And that's basically it. What you have to do is you have to use what you already know. Then you can use Stack Overflow or Google to solve some logical stuff, or to get ideas, or to get solutions to quick fixes, or to get quick fixes to problems. But if you want to understand something, if you want to look up something, usually you want to go to the documentation. And I do this all the time. Every time I want to use grid search, for example, scikit-learn, I have to remember scikit-learn, grid search. I have to always look up how it works. Not because I'm inexperienced, but because I always have to remember the order of the parameters and the structure of what I'm passing into it. And I think here are also examples. If they're not examples, there's at least the first parameter or the second parameter actually, parameter grid, and it tells you here it's a dictionary, and it explains how this dictionary has to be structured. So even though I have used grid search CV, I don't know how many times, definitely around 50, 60, 70 times already, if not more, I always have to come back to the documentation to look it up. And of course, you can also use Stack Overflow, but it's just more professional to look into the actual documentation, especially because things change, and especially because here you have the raw information and not just a use case where you can look at an example and try to recognize the pattern of how this library works. So yeah, this is essentially how you read documentation. The most important thing for beginners is don't get overwhelmed by it. Notice the similarity in structure. You have a getting started section, a user guide usually, where you have some more tutorial-like examples, and then you have the raw API reference where you just have the different parts of the package explained in this typical documentation type of way. So getting started is the introduction, user guide is the more tutorial-like, blog post-like examples, and API reference is just the raw documentation. And you will find that structure almost everywhere. Sometimes it's going to be more difficult to find. Sometimes it's more obvious. Here again, install, user guide, API. You can see that in almost all the packages. And this is how you read the documentation. So that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you learned something. If so, let me know by hitting a like button and leaving a comment in the comment section down below. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell to not miss a single future video for free. Other than that, thank you much for watching. See you in the next video, and bye.